universal credit and the decision by the government to withdraw the extra £20 a week that they had given to people on universal credit at the beginning of the pandemic. And this has created one hell of a lot of controversy and debate. Obviously, you've got those on the right and the far right who are arguing it was only temporary. And then you've got those who are much more liberal-minded on the left, etc., who argue that for a lot of these people, you're taking away money that is absolutely a necessity. And what right have the people who are multimillionaires to have got to make these decisions where they take £20 a week from people who are already absolutely struggling? And obviously, as it's been pointed out, at the same time as they've now agreed a 1.25 increase in national insurance. So for those who are actually in the workplace, not only are they paying more national insurance, but they're also receiving less from the welfare state to support what is already, for many of them, low incomes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, shocking. It's yet more examples here, with the universal credit cap, with the increase in national insurance, the rate of national insurance. Again, just yet more examples of the Conservatives clobbering the poor, clobbering ordinary working people, favouring wealth going to the rich, more and more wealth going to the rich in the country. And, economists have described the, most recent past 10, 12 years as the biggest shift of wealth from the poor to the rich in the history of this country. That's how economists have described what's happened under this Conservative government. And we just see policy after policy after policy, which has that effect. And they wrap it up in different ways, them and their media friends. But that's essentially what it is: clobbering the poor, favouring the rich, making sure more and more money, including now, of course, vast amounts of public money going into the private hands of the wealthy, the rich, many of whom, of course, are Tory donors and keep the Tories in power. So it's a sort of merry-go-round for the rich and privileged and powerful, a merry-go-round of wealth, and gorging themselves on it, and even going joyriding around space, while more and more of the general population are suffering, being unable to pay their bills, unable to get on the housing ladder, unable to pay their rent, unable to feed their children. And this cut to universal credit is just sickening. The Tories excused it, of course, by saying it was only meant as a temporary measure during COVID. But of course, what that did when they raised it, and due to lots more people needing universal credit because of the pandemic, it really highlighted to people how pitifully low the universal credit payments were. And there are lots of people who, before the pandemic, were sort of saying, oh, they live the life of Riley, these people on universal credit. They've all got big screen tellies and iPhones, and spend all their money on booze and fags, and they're living a wonderful life. And of course, then some of them actually had to live on universal credit and realised it's not just tough, it's almost impossible for people to live any kind of a decent and healthy life on universal credit. And and hence the Tories increased it by a measly 20 quid, and now they're taking that away again. Yeah.
And the problem is as well, is that doesn't matter what it is, we get used to things. So our lifestyle, if it's in the medium to sort of longer term, it becomes our new norm. So by taking it away and going back to an old norm means yet again, for many, many people, hundreds of thousands, millions of people, they have to reacclimatize back to the old norm. And it psychologically, in terms of mental health, as well as obviously being able to purchase the necessities for your day-to-day, week-to-week existence. All of it comes together, all culminates to have a negative effect. So even though it's just a straightforward policy for the Tories that they simply vote for in the chamber and retract, for millions of people, it's their daily existence, and it's a behaviour that's had to adapt and now having to readapt. And we've received an article on Dorset Eye looking at specifically at Dorset and the incredible numbers, Tom. 11,000 families just across Dorset, working households. We're not talking people who choose not to work here, Tom. We're talking about working households, people who are already in work. However, their employers are paying them an income that isn't sufficient for them to support their family and themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the ultimate problem here. The private sector is getting away with paying a lot less than it should, and it's constantly, the burden is constantly being picked up by the state, the taxpayer. Everybody needs to be aware of this. Yeah. You know, we talk about having a swelling big state. Well, the reason we've got such a swollen state, for those people who don't like swollen states, is because the private sector is not living up to the bargain.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a couple of points there. One is, it should be noted, obviously, that the vast majority of people on universal credit are working people. And the second point, obviously, as you say, is that that what universal credit and the welfare state is often doing is subsidising the private sector, subsidising employers whose business model is based on paying their staff not enough to live on.
Yes, absolutely. If
we
made it policy,
with go on.
So if it's say the government stepped in and said, you will only exist in the private sector if you offer the nationally negotiated living wage. But of course, the Conservative Party is never going to do that, as you said earlier, because their donors would spontaneously combust.
Yeah. I had a discussion with somebody, a local small business owner, before the last election about the £10 an hour minimum wage proposal in the Corbyn's Labour manifesto. And he employs people at he employed people at, a fair bit less than that. One or two of his staff who did sort of casual menial kind of work. He said, I can't afford to pay them £10 an hour, for what they're doing. I pay them like whatever it was, £8 or whatever. He said, I can't afford to pay them £10 an hour. And I said, well, then you don't really have a business. In my opinion, if you have a business where you can't afford to pay people a wage that's enough to live on, then your whole business model is based on exploitation. And in my opinion, you don't have a business. You have an exploitation of other people to create profit for yourself. That's not a reasonable business model. That's a business model that's very detrimental to our society. But that's a difference in political opinion.
It's also an empirical fact, because I suspect if you go to that person's house and you see the cars in their drive, that's where the differential between what they should be paying them and what they're actually paying their employees goes, on their own material possessions. So their argument about them not being able to afford it is very often false. What they actually mean is they won't be able to afford their current standard of living if they help to raise that of their employees.
Yeah.
If we look at a report today, and this isn't, coming from some left-wing think tank. This is actually coming from within the government and from within, the Financial Times. Internal government analysis shows impact of cutting universal credit will be catastrophic. According to the report in the Financial Times, the government's own internal analysis of its decision to cut universal credit from the start of October by ending the temporary £20 £20 per week uplift introduced during the pandemic says the impact will be catastrophic. The paper says a well-placed Whitehall official said the government's own analysis highlighted the deep impact of reversing the change. The internal modelling of ending the universal credit uplift is catastrophic. Homelessness and poverty are likely to rise. Food bank usage will soar. It could be the real disaster of the autumn. And bearing in mind that COVID hasn't gone away, and this is the time of year now we're going to start to see COVID kicking back, one minister warned that the political backlash over universal credit, which is claimed by 6 million people, was likely to be more serious for Prime Minister Boris Johnson than the debate about social care. There's no doubt that this is going to have a serious impact on thousands of people, and colleagues are really worried. I think it will definitely eclipse social care as a problem. It's not just the Red Wall MPs who are fearing a major backlash from the public, and people can go on and read through. But if we now bring it back to more local, to Dorset, most families hit by a 1,040 per annum cut are in work, says anti-poverty campaigners, as we've already identified. Many of those affected by the cut will be key workers, 1 to 2 UC. So these people who were being celebrated throughout the pandemic are now being kicked right in the groin, again by the government, who've reneged on their promises. And we've been hearing from Boris Johnson about the Conservative Party is now the party for levelling up. But what you actually find is that with the national insurance increase and with the universal credit decrease, it's not, it's a complete opposite. It's levelling down. So it's not just about the fact that they have tried to get people to readjust to something that was part of their past. They're also filling the airways with a narrative that in practice, it simply isn't true. So that the levelling up, and if we had a strong opposition, if we had a strong leader of the opposition who didn't take any prisoners, then this information would be out there. If we had a Labour Party that wasn't at war with itself and tried to be some centrist utopia for people who love capitalism, who have big houses but have a little bit of a conscience every so often, if we had something different to that, then Boris Johnson would be, he'd be like, the First World War soldier who's all crampled up in the barbed wire as they go across no man's land. But we haven't. And because he's getting away with such a soft touch from the opposition, these lies, propagated often by the billionaire corporate media, continue over and over and over. And because people have chosen their sides, whether it's they loved Boris because he got them through COVID, or he loved Boris because he got them out of the European Union. But nothing's changed for these people. Their lives are still a mess. They're no less a mess for leaving the European Union. And they're actually probably a lot more of a mess because they've supported the Conservatives and Boris Johnson.
Yeah, I mean, people are suffering, and sadly, as we've seen for 11 years now, people are continuing to vote for policies that are bad for them. They're persuaded by the corporate media machine, by the billionaires, to vote for things that are really bad for them, but really good for the billionaires. It's terribly sad, as well as incredibly frustrating. For people like you and I that that pay some attention at least to what's happening in this country. But it's extraordinary how propaganda works, and it's extraordinary how right-wing propaganda has consistently managed to get people to vote against their own interests. And just as a wider point on the welfare state and what propaganda has done. As you know, I'm on some political discussion groups, which includes some rather praised right-wing supporters of right-wing policies, and they rail against the welfare state in various ways, universal credit benefits and what have you. And they constantly you know, describe it as handouts, people are scrounging, people are lazy, etc. You know, ignoring the fact the vast majority of people, you know, getting universal credit are working. Some are working more than one job, but they love to describe the benefits as handouts. They love to describe the recipients as scroungers, as lazy scroungers. And it made me think that, you know, they've been propagandized by, you know, the Sun newspaper has been doing that stuff for 30 plus years, you know, describing our welfare state in such negative terms, describing recipients as scroungers, and, you know, attacking single parents, attacking people that claim benefits. Of course, completely failing to attack the tax evasion and tax avoidance schemes of the rich, which takes, you know, far more money out of the economy than benefit fraud, than any sort of benefit fraud. Tax fraud is, you know, 15, 20 times more money, you know, that should be going to the exchequer when compared to benefit fraud. But it made me think about the whole idea of the welfare state used to be, I think, something that as a nation, most people were proud of. You know, I, for one, am proud to live in a country where we have a system of welfare that looks after the most vulnerable, the poor and the most vulnerable in society, and gives them a leg up, gives them some support, gives them a hand, especially when times are tough. If someone's lost a job, or they've got a long-term illness, or they've become disabled, or you know, they've lost a house, or whatever it may be, they're you know, in work but on very low wages or whatever. We have a system that helps those people. that creates a good, decent society. It's a good thing, the welfare state. But I think, you know, 30 plus years of right-wing propaganda has made a lot of people really dislike the welfare state and think that it's handouts and think that the recipients are scroungers. And you know, you could argue that that whole propaganda campaign from the right has been fairly successful in influencing people. And one of the most successful tools in propaganda, particularly in recent years, and particularly in America, but also happening here, is to provoke resentment. Someone is taking away something that belongs to you. Benefit scroungers are taking your money. Immigrants are taking your jobs. Immigrants are taking your place in the NHS queue. You know, these things create resentment amongst ordinary people. These propaganda weapons of the right, and resentment is a very, very strong tool, and it's one that, you know, Trump used consistently in order to get elected, and whilst he was president, is stoking resentment, blaming certain groups of people and stoking resentment amongst the general population. And it's part of the divide and rule of, you know, dividing the working classes, but it's particularly based, I think, around resentment. And I think resentment, that right-wing propaganda around resentment, has led to us no longer being proud of our welfare state, and ordinary people railing against it, which I think is desperately sad and bad for our society.
This is probably a discussion we should probably have another time about the welfare state holistically, but I sort of disagree with you to a large extent there, Tom, primarily because I think the welfare state has only ever been a tool for capitalism to give some sort of sense of fairness and to keep the exploited workers well and healthy and not mutinying. We shouldn't need a welfare state. We should have a society that means we simply never require it. Yeah. The only reason we have a welfare state is because we have such an unequal, top-heavy system that loads all the wealth into the hands of a very, very small number of people, who then dictate how billions and billions of people should live their lives. So that's probably a discussion for another time.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're right there, Jace. That's very true. Yeah.
So in terms of universal credit, I think we need to just let people be aware that reducing the universal credit across the board is going to have an absolutely dramatic effect. And for those people who agree that universal credit should be cut, I think they should also prepare themselves for the consequences. Because, you know, they have blood on their hands. Those people who take their own lives, those people who die earlier as a direct result, it's simply down to the people who support this policy. And any policy that takes anything away from somebody else that they need to keep their physical and their mental faculties in a sort of healthy shape, so to speak, if they agree with that, then they are complicit in what comes next.
And Jace, you know, as I think we discussed before, the gap in life expectancy between rich and poor and people living in affluent areas and poorer areas is growing and growing and growing. And in some places that gap is 10 years, you know, the life expectancy. So if you're wealthy, you're going to live, you know, in a lot of parts of the country, you're likely to live around 10 years longer than people that are poorer and live in poorer areas for all sorts of reasons to do with health, housing, etc., etc. And here in Weymouth, you know, in a couple of miles distance from each other, the gap is 9 years within Weymouth. If you live in one area of Weymouth around Preston, or if you live in Melcombe Regis in the town centre, you're talking a couple of miles away. The difference in life expectancy is now 9 years. I mean, that's staggering. So to force people into poverty, it is what we've discussed before, that concept of social murder.
Yes.
You know, policies that kill people early.
Yes.
It's despicable. And of course, as I wrote about at the time, you know, when the increase, the £20 increase was a week increase was introduced, there was clearly a discussion between Sunak and Boris Johnson, where Sunak said, yeah, we'll increase it by £20 a week, and Johnson obviously went, £20 a week, that's not a lot, and Sunak went, all right, I'll make it £1,000 a year. And Johnson went, oh, yeah, that's better. And actually, I mean, I've kind of joked about that, but actually they always wanted the increase. They always wanted to refer to it as £1,000 a year. It sounds so much more. Now that they're taking it away, they're always wanting to describe it as £20 a week.
Yeah.
Like that's nothing. They're not describing it as £1,000 a year anymore.
No. And to, you know, the last point on this is that Anne Widdecombe supports the removal of the £20 a week, and she calls herself a Christian. Say no more.